back to the spring semester of the Leyte Lecture series, which is funded by the class of the 1950 Museum Endowment in recognition of the significant contribution made to the endowment by the Leyte Trust. Vice Admiral Leyte, Naval Academy class, Vice Admiral Leyte, Naval Academy class of 1933, was a naval aviator participating in World War II operations against the Japanese at New Guinea, Saipan, Guam, the Palaus, and the Philippines. Was awarded the Navy Cross and Distinguished Flying Cross. And we're doing something a little different than today. We're very fortunate to have a collection of over 1,000 models in 1 to 700 scale donated by Donald S. Montgomery, retired director of the Naval Media Center. His many years of research and his passion for model building led him down the path to construct not one, but 2 complete Japanese navies, along with the U.S., British, German, and other World War II navies. Now, not shown today are the Japanese destroyers at Leyte, but they are in our collection. And I want to thank our ship model director, Don Pruill, for making this all happen today, and he'll be available to you over here right after the lecture if you have any questions about our boat models and specifically about making these. It's truly my pleasure and honor to introduce Thomas J. Cutler, retired Navy Lieutenant Commander, former gunner's mate 2nd class, who served in patrol craft, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. His varied assignments included an in-country Vietnam tour, small craft command, and 9 years at the U.S. Naval Academy, where he served as executive assistant to the chairman of the Seamanship and Navigation Department and associate chairman of the History Department. While at the Naval Academy, he was awarded the William P. Clements Award for Excellence in Education, Military Teacher of the Year. Currently, he is Fleet Professor of Strategy and Policy with the Naval War College and is the Director of Professional Publishing at the U.S. Naval Institute. The author of many books and articles, he is the winner of the Alfred Thayer Mahan Award for Naval Literature, the U.S. Maritime Literature Award, and the Naval Institute Press Author of the Year Award. And it's very much my honor because he's also one of my former professors and one of my mentors. So, Commander, the floor is yours, sir. Thanks.
No better way to feel like a fossil than to have somebody introduce you that way. Okay, what you're about to see here is my 3-hour lecture that I give to the midshipmen at the Naval Academy and the students at the Naval War College, the abridged version. The lady back there almost passed out when I said that, but at any rate, this is the abridged version. And if you'll bear with me for one moment, I'd like to take a personal note in this. The dedication to my book is to 2 wonderful people, Ann and Hans Schuler. As you can read there, they meant a great deal to me. And I feel very honored and that their daughter is here to join us for this today. So I just wanted to point that out. Battle of Leyte Gulf. So you can see here, this is one huge battle. Lots of statistics behind the thing. Pretty mind-boggling. If you look at this fleet down here, this is just one side, okay? These are the underdogs in essence. And look how many ships there are. Think about how many people are on each one of those ships. And it boggles the mind when you think about it. And a lot of these people would not survive this battle we're about to talk about here today. But the things that make this battle very unique and unusual is the fact that it's the last clash of battleships, the fact that the U.S. aircraft carrier, the only time one has ever been sunk by gunfire. But more importantly, these are the things that make this battle such a great case study for the War College and for midshipmen and so forth, because it's full of all kinds of good and bad aspects, as you can see. And also down here it says a host of lessons learned. That didn't quite make it on the screen there, but it's an ideal case study for that. Ouch. This all began with General Douglas MacArthur. When he was forced to leave the Philippines early in the war. The Japanese had marched into the Philippines, and MacArthur was forced to leave by the president. He actually had to leave his troops behind. And the reason for this was that the president did not want this very famous figure to be captured and paraded through the streets of Tokyo. This would not have been exactly good for morale and a few other things. And despite MacArthur's protests, he was ordered to leave the Philippines, and he left by PT boat in a rather daring operation that earned the commander of that PT boat in the squadron Medal of Honor. But when MacArthur got to the Philippines, he of course uttered these famous words, I shall return. Now you'll notice the pronoun here tells a lot about this man. It's not we shall return, it is I shall return. It says a lot about MacArthur. What you have to understand about MacArthur is this is a larger than life figure. This guy, way before World War II, had done almost everything there was to do. He exhibited courage on the battlefield in World War I, was actually a brigadier general in World War I. He was the youngest superintendent at West Point. He was the youngest chief of staff of the Army, graduated first in his class. I mean, this guy was, as I said, larger than life in many, many ways. But he also knew it. And the ego, of course, went along with it. And he was very good at image building. But as a result of that, MacArthur, then and now, was either revered as a saint or seen as the devil incarnate. Very few people fall in between. I claim to be in between. But there are, generally most people you say name Douglas MacArthur and they either want to throw darts or they want to sing his hymns of praise. Very, very polarizing figure. But MacArthur is a larger than life figure, and Roosevelt can't do without him. He's a big public relations figure, if nothing else. He's also a talented general in many ways. So the question, oh, terrific. So the question becomes, there we go. What do we do with Douglas MacArthur once he's extracted from the Philippines? There are some in this country that thought that MacArthur ought to be running the entire war, that he should be the general in charge of everything. There were others who threatened to jump out of windows if that were the case. A lot of controversy, and I could spend a lot more time on it, but moving ahead, what we ultimately did, we solved the problem by dividing the Pacific up into two theaters. Nimitz, Admiral Nimitz, because it is a naval theater, it made a lot of sense to have a naval commander. He got the Central Pacific, and Douglas MacArthur got the Southwest Pacific. The Central Pacific, most of you have heard of Tarawa and Iwo Jima, and a lot of the famous names from there. These down here in MacArthur's realm were a lot less known, but very important nonetheless. These two prongs, this resulted in two prongs actually marching across the Pacific simultaneously, and the Japanese had to respond. Something would be going on in the Central Pacific and they would move their major elements to meet that threat. Next thing you know, MacArthur's doing something down here in New Guinea and they would have to respond, and so what kept the Japanese off guard a lot of the time. So we got these two advancing prongs going simultaneously, some advantages to it. This was all devised as a political thing. The reason that they did this was not a military strategy, it was political. What do we do with Douglas MacArthur? And that's why this was set up this way. But it turned out it worked fairly well. As those prongs converge, though, across the Pacific, they come to a point where what do we do? They're going to come together at some point, and where would that be? And the Navy wanted to go to Formosa, today is known as Taiwan, and the Army wanted to go to the Philippines. The Army, of course, being Douglas MacArthur, for probably some very good reasons to go to the Philippines, but also because I shall return. So we got a major standoff between these two commanders, and it actually falls upon Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president, to mediate in this thing. So Roosevelt gets on a cruiser, the USS Baltimore, and travels out to Pearl Harbor and meets with MacArthur, who comes from his headquarters down in the Southwest Pacific, and joins Nimitz, and they get together to figure out what to do with the strategy in the Pacific at this point. Both of them presented their cases. Nimitz and MacArthur, they both were very smart. They brought lots of maps. FDR loved maps. And they presented their cases, and I'd like to go into a lot of detail about it, but we just don't have the time. There were some very good arguments for both going to both places, but ultimately the Philippines, the president sided with MacArthur and said, we will go to the Philippines and you shall return. As a result of that, we invaded the Philippines. This Operation King II, the landings were done at Leyte Gulf on the eastern side of the Philippines. Famous movie about MacArthur was Gregory Peck. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there's a great scene in there where he walks up to the map and says, "We shall invade at Leyte," and then he slams his hand over on the wrong side of the map, but that's okay. True story. At any rate, Operation King II, MacArthur does in fact return to the Philippines. For this operation, remember, we've got these two prongs, and we got to figure out what to do with these. We really have two fleets. One of them has been operating, Vice Admiral Kincaid has been operating the 7th Fleet under MacArthur's control, and the 3rd Fleet has been marching across the Pacific, and at this particular time is under the command of William F. Halsey, Bull Halsey to those who dared to call him that. At any rate, so you have these two admirals with their missions were that the 7th Fleet was going to support the amphibious assault, the actual landing. They're going to shell the shore and prepare the landing for the troops going ashore. And Halsey's got this gigantic 3rd Fleet out there that's just going to kind of mill around to be there if needed and to support and defend these landings if needed, but also with the additional, well, I'll get to that in just a second. But anyway, notice the immediate superiors here, okay? Kincaid is answering to MacArthur. Halsey is answering to Nimitz. You've got two fleets operating in the same general area under two different commanders. What's wrong with this picture? To get an overall commander between these two, you have to go all the way to Washington, D.C., the way this chain of command was set up. There's nobody in charge of the overall thing. Each one of these is doing their own thing. This contributes to some of the problems that we'll see in just a few minutes. Nemesis Instructions, you can see here to Halsey, support the landings and so forth, but this is also very important here because he also says destroy enemy naval air forces if they show up, in essence. If the Japanese fleet shows up to oppose this landing, that's your job is to take them on and destroy them if at all possible. Well, the Japanese do decide to respond to this. They send Operation Show 1, which is Victory 1. They've got 4 converging forces that are going to come together at Leyte Gulf. This is basically what's left of the Japanese Navy. It's going to go in an all-out effort. As you can see, it's a sizable force, even though, well, I'll get to the even though in just a second. This is the plan, and it looks fairly complicated, but I think we can clear it up a little bit here by pointing out that you have Admiral Kurita has this one force that starts down in Linga Roads, down where the oil was and so forth, and comes up this way. Can't see this very well, but anyway, he comes up across here through the central Philippines, out through San Bernardino Strait, right here, and then he's going to come down onto Leyte. This is where the landings are taking place. That's Admiral Kurita. You've also got now Admiral Nishimura. He's also coming from down south, Linga Roads, with his force, and he's going to come around the southern part of the Philippines up through a place called Surigao Strait. The idea being you're getting two forces coming in on the Americans from two different directions. Another force is under Admiral Shima. He's coming down from the home waters in Japan, and he's heading down here, and he's going to also come up through Surigao Strait. He's going to supplement. These forces are represented here on the table, by the way, when you get a chance to look at it. This is Admiral Kurita. You can see he's got the larger force here, the one that's coming around and coming from this direction. These other two here are represented over here by Nishimura and Shima. Now that leaves one more group, and that's Admiral Ozawa. He's coming down from the north. Now Ozawa's got a really interesting job to do here. He's got the aircraft carriers, the aircraft carriers that are basically left to the Japanese Navy. They've been decimated at Midway, at various other places. And what the Japanese know, and we are not fully aware of at this point, is that they're almost out of pilots in aircraft. I mean, they are mostly pilots. They've lost most of them at this point. So these aircraft carriers, even though you've got a group of aircraft carriers coming from the north, they're basically impotent. They don't have a lot of striking power at this point. So the plan here is, the hope is that they can serve as a decoy and lure off some of the American forces. They know that there's going to be a lot of American forces at this point in the war, and they're going to be here, and they're going to hope that they can lure them northward to get them out of the battle, so that these other two groups can do their thing much more effectively. When you think about it, it's a pretty good plan, considering what they had to work with. But there are two vital elements in this. One is the pincher. You've got to bring these two things together, and then the decoy force. As you can see what I've illustrated here, these things depend on, one, the pincher timing. If one side of the pliers is working and the other doesn't do very much pinching, right? The timing, of course, is one element, and then, of course, the luck part. You've got to hope that you're spotted and that it will draw off sufficient forces to make a difference with this decoy. So that's the plan. Quick overview of the battle. I'll just run through the quick elements and then I'll talk about them specifically. The first thing that happens is the Americans land at Leyte, over here, not over here, Gregory Peck. They land over on that side. And the very first engagement that takes place is over here at a place called the Palawan Passage. Again, I'll talk about these specifically in just a moment. The next one is the battle here in the Sibuyan Sea and the Sulu Sea in the central Philippines, and then Surigao Strait down here. Up to the north, you see Cape Engano, that battle, and then finally the battle off Samar. Now, this will all make some more sense as we go forward, but these are the elements of, as you can see, the Battle of Leyte Gulf is actually a series of battles. It all serves one particular purpose and is all related, but it's actually a series of several battles taking place over several days. First occurrence, as I said, was in Palawan Passage, and Kurita, with this large force you see here in the center, is preceding all these battleships and cruisers and escorting destroyers, which you don't see on the table. They're all coming up through the Palawan Passage there. And as luck would have it, there were two U.S. submarines that happened to be in the area, the Darter and the Dace. These two submarines were looked up, popped up their periscopes and said, oh my God. They saw this gigantic Japanese force coming towards them. They were ideally positioned, and so they attacked. They wind up sinking two of the cruisers, the Maya and the Otago. So those two cruisers are out of the equation. And one of them happens to be Kurita's flagship, one of these cruisers that goes down. Now keep in mind, Kurita survives this, but keep this in mind when you think about events that happened later on in this battle. Kurita goes for a midnight swim. Not a fun thing to do, okay, under the circumstances. He also, when he's rescued, part of his staff is rescued on one destroyer, and part of his staff, he doesn't get his full staff back together, so now he's missing part of his staff. There's some chaos involved here, and he's going to a new flagship where he doesn't have a lot of the materials that he originally had to work with. So that's going to influence Kurita to a certain extent, I think. They also torpedoed and damaged another heavy cruiser, and two destroyers were assigned to escort the cruiser out. At this point in this desperation, I don't know why they sacrificed these destroyers to go with them, but that's the decision that Kurita made. So those also were out of the equation. Okay, the morning of 24 October now, Kurita has continued north despite the torpedoing. He's now headed into the Sibuyan Sea here in the central part of the Philippines. And at the same time, that other force, Nishimura, is coming up through the Sulu Sea further south. Halsey, with his third fleet out there, they're sending reconnaissance flights out. They see these Japanese forces, and so they strike. And they spend the better part of the day striking at these forces relentlessly. They do a considerable amount of damage, including the fact that they have this thing called the Musashi. Now, if you look at these models, when you get a chance to look at these models, you'll notice that two of them here are way out of scale, it looks like, compared to the others. These are big ships. These are battleships next to them. These are super battleships, Yamato and Musashi. They're the biggest battleships ever built in the history of the world. They have the biggest guns, 18.1-inch guns. The biggest guns we had on our battleships were 16-inch. So these are much bigger. When these guns fired on these ships, they would shatter most of the light bulbs on the ship. Nobody could be out on deck when they fired the guns. It would kill them. It would rearrange their organs from the concussion of these things. These are powerful, powerful ships, but they've never been tested in action. And by the time they get to Leyte Gulf, if you'll notice, by the way, one of these, the Yamato, has a lot of anti-aircraft batteries aboard. The Musashi had not gotten hers installed at this point. There's no air cover, and they've got all of these American airplanes attacking them relentlessly. The one thing that they do come up with, and the reason I have shotguns on there, is because they come up with this rather innovative thought. They design special shells for these 18.1-inch guns that will fire something akin to a lot of shrapnel. They'll fill the air with like buckshot, almost similar to a shotgun. The idea of throwing all this stuff out there and the airplanes coming in will fly through it and their wings will be lopped off and that sort of stuff. Good idea, just didn't really work very well. They just weren't able to bring them to bear in time and so forth, and didn't really have much effect. As a result of all this, the Musashi is actually sunk. Now this is, when these ships were designed, they were kind of like the Titanic. These ships will never sink and that sort of thing. Well, prove that one wrong. Now a lot of the aviators concentrated on Musashi and left some of the other ships alone, but the end result was she went down. Tremendous loss of life, by the way. At this point, Kurita says, enough. Enough of this. He's been pounded all day. He turns around and starts heading back west. Okay. Keep that in mind, all right? We get to the night of 24, 25 October, and going back to our map here, you'll see that Kurita, at this point, by the way, you need to know that Kurita, in the middle of the night, the attacks have stopped. He's rethinking the thing. What am I supposed to do now? He actually turns back around and starts heading east again. So he was turned back during the day by the attacks, but at night he decides, what the hell, and starts heading east again under the cover of darkness. Nishimura, these guys who are coming up they start heading for Surigao Strait, like I indicated before. They would come up through this strait. And Admiral Kincaid, remember he's the commander of the 7th Fleet, which is guarding the landing site and so forth. He prepares. Halsey, we'll talk about him in a minute. Kincaid orders a subordinate, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, to prepare a welcome, and a welcome he does prepare. The first thing he does is he puts PT boats down here, these little small craft down at the entrance to Surigao Strait, because he figures the Japanese are coming there. They can launch some night attacks with torpedoes, and they can also, more importantly, alert the other forces that the Japanese are in fact coming. So they're serving as a reconnaissance role. The battleships way up at the top of there, he puts those across the northern part of the straits, and also the cruisers, the heavy cruisers and the light cruisers, a little further down, a little further south. And what he does with all of these big gun ships is he has them cruising back and forth across the strait there. He knows that the Japanese have to come up through this narrow strait, probably in a column or two, and they're going to be somewhat vulnerable to, I'll illustrate this in just a minute. One thing I do want to point out is there's a thing called a turn and a thing called a corpin in the Navy, okay, if you're talking tactics and so forth. And in a turn, if you got ships in a column, when you give the order to turn, everybody turns together. Okay, that means that the ship that was in the lead before is now at the caboose end, right? But that's a turn. A corpin is more like a choo-choo train. If you give it order a corpin, this ship turns, the next ship follows in his wake, and they all spin around like a choo-choo train, right? Which would you use if you're the admiral up here steaming back and forth? Turn or a corpin? What? We don't leave until you get this resolved. No. Okay, turn. The reason being, when you turn, all ships are turning simultaneously, so their batteries, their gun batteries, are for just briefly pointing in the wrong direction. They come down the other side, they swing the batteries out this way, and they're now pointing in the right direction. If you do the choo-choo train, the ships that are over here are masking the batteries of these ships as they're waiting for them to come around. It's just not a good situation. Keep that in mind. The destroyers, the last part of this element, he puts the destroyers up here at this part of the straits, and they're going to come racing down the sides of this thing after the gunships have had their way, and they're going to launch torpedoes. Destroyers are torpedo launchers, as well as carrying guns and so forth, and they're going to use torpedoes to attack the Japanese. Number one, it's a good weapon. If you can hit somebody with a torpedo, it usually ruins their entire day. The other thing that's good about them is gunfire puts off flashes. You can see the enemy there, but they're going to be coming down up close and personal, launching torpedoes. They can do that in the dark and stay relatively hidden. Anyway, pretty good tactics when you think about it. Okay, so Nishimura, leading the way, comes up through the strait as expected, followed by Shima. Now, why they followed, don't have a lot of time to spend on this. These guys didn't like each other, believe it or not. They hated each other. And the Japanese chain of command was somewhat messed up, to say the least. So they operated independently, even though they're on the same mission. Go figure. Personalities. At any rate, they do come up through the strait. The PT boats do their thing. They launch their attacks. They don't do any damage to speak of, but they do, in fact, send radio messages. Here they come. So as the Japanese come up through there in their column, the battleships and the cruisers open up on schedule. The destroyers charge down just like they're supposed to. Everything goes exactly the way it's meant to be. One thing you have to understand is an old thing in naval tactics. This goes all the way back to the days of sail. It still applies even to this modern time. It's called crossing the T. Ships are long and narrow, so if you can get your ship to cross I've got it upside down here for a T, but you get the picture. If you can cross the T of the other guy, what ultimately happens is he can only bring his forward batteries to bear. You've got all your beam batteries. You can see the advantage of crossing the T. And it applies to formations as well. Same principle. All these batteries can deliver fire. Only the forward ships can respond, crossing the T. The U.S. Navy does, in fact, cross the T here. And to make things even worse, there are two Japanese mistakes that are made. The first one, you can figure out, the coordination. Not only do these guys hate each other, they're coming up separately. They don't even talk to each other. Nishimura is getting the hell pounded out of him by this barrage of gunfire and stuff. Doesn't even bother to tell the guy behind him, hey, things are kind of dicey up here. No communication whatsoever. Lets the other guy come up and take his turn. The other thing is, back to turn versus Korpen. When Nishimura is coming up through the strait here, and he decides enough of this, he's getting destroyed. What do I do about it? I need to turn around and get the hell out of here. It's time to, discretion is the better part of valor. So he orders his fleet to turn around and go the other way. What are you going to use? Turn or a Korpen? Obviously, right? Because all ships turn simultaneously and you get the hell out of there. He orders a Korpen. So every ship now gets a turn to come up and take its turn and get pounded the hell out of. Okay? Remember, this guy took a midnight swim, so be kind. I'm sorry, he did not. I got admirals mixed up. Did not. I take that back. He doesn't have an excuse. Okay. Let's go back to Bull Halsey. Fascinating guy, colorful character. I mentioned the Spruance factor. There had been some problems where Spruance had been criticized in the last operation for not being more aggressive. Halsey didn't need anybody to tell him to be aggressive. This guy had missed all the major battles of the war and was just itching for a fight. If I had more time, I'd explain all that. It's a fascinating story, but we've got to keep moving here. At any rate, Halsey's itching for a fight. Keep that in mind. Halsey had seen Kurita turn around earlier in the day before, and was heading back the other way. He'd pretty much sent him packing. And in the meantime, his reconnaissance picks up the fact that this force is coming down from the north, Ozawa, with these carriers. And Ozawa does everything he can to get his attention, by the way. He's broadcasting radio messages in the clear, lots of them. He's got these airplanes drop their tail hooks just to, oh, by the way, make sure they know their naval aircraft and so forth. He's doing everything he can to get attention of the Americans, and it works. Halsey's people pick it up. They say, hey, there's carriers to the north. Halsey goes, all right. Remember, he doesn't know that they're impotent at this point. So Halsey goes after the carriers, goes after Ozawa. Here's the problem. This guy's got the biggest fleet ever created in the history of man. 4 task groups, each one with multiple carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. I mean, huge. Look at this thing, and it's way bigger than this, okay? Huge. He takes the entire fleet with him. Again, if we had more time, we could analyze why he did that. Nobody knows for sure, obviously, without getting into his mind, but at any rate. So as a result, he goes to the north, and we have this battle of the Cape Engano, where he does, in fact, attack this force and does some damage to Ozawa. These are some of the participants, and you can see that the odds against are not good. Goes on all day, 527 sorties. You can see there's some damage there. They did not do as much damage as you might think under the circumstances. But there's also a problem going on at the same time, a serious problem, and that is the fact that before he left, Halsey he sent a message out proposing, and notice I've got that in red, proposing breaking off a surface combatant force to stay behind and guard the landing force. He was thinking, at least, in what I think was the right mode. But he sent this message out and said something to the effect of, this thing will be formed. Well, he was using the word will, meaning as a future tense kind of thing. Not that it's being formed now, but it will be formed sometime in the future. Trouble is, when we talk in the military, we have a tendency to use the word will, saying, you will square away. You will polish your shoes. You will, you understand? There's a different thing there. And that many people assumed that thing had been executed and that Task Force 34 had been created. Kincaid, in particular, the commander of the 7th Fleet there at the landing forces, he thinks this. Now keep in mind, first of all, it's not true, but keep in mind that Halsey's messages were not even intended for Kincaid. Remember, they're completely separate units out there. But Kincaid's not stupid. He's listening in on the message traffic, reading Halsey's mail there to figure out what's going on. Unfortunately, he gets confused because the setup message that Halsey had sent was sent out on high-frequency radio. High frequency travels over the horizon. It's got a long-distance effect. Kincaid picks that up. When Halsey later sends a message out saying we're not going to do Task Force 34, he sends that out by UHF, ultra-high frequency. That's got more of a line-of-sight approach, and Kincaid doesn't pick that up. So there you have it. To make matters worse, there's a message. At this point, Nimitz is monitoring all this back in Pearl Harbor. Admiral Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, he's wondering what's going on here. He's getting concerned. He thought there was a Task Force 34, but it doesn't seem to be doing anything. You'll see why in a few minutes when we talk about the next phase. But at any rate, he's getting very concerned. He sends a message off to Halsey. Where is Task Force 34? Wants to know where it is. What's interesting is, if you'll notice, there's this phrase, turkey trots to water, and this one, the world wonders after. This is padding. Whenever they sent messages back in this time frame, they would pad the message with a lot of meaningless stuff to make it harder for the code breakers to break. Okay? It's clear by the fact that if you look at this message, you see the GG here and this RR here. That should have told anybody reading it that that's the main message. Anything outside of those markers is padding. But as it turned out, the poor guy that added this padding, if you see turkey trots to water, doesn't mean anything. But the world wonders. This guy picked this phrase, and I think the reason was that this battle took place on the anniversary of the Battle of Balaclava, the famous charge of the Light Brigade, and there's a poem in there, and one of the lines in that poem is, all the world wonders. So one has to think that this perhaps influenced him. We don't know for absolute sure. At any rate, Halsey gets this message. He's humiliated and upset when he sees the world wonders. It sounds like Nimitz is really putting it to him. You know, the whole world's wondering where the hell your task force is. As a result, Halsey is very angry, humiliated. He literally throws his cap down on the deck. He's got tears in his eyes. He and Nimitz were very good friends, by the way, on top of being commander and subordinate. Anyway, he turns his fleet back around and starts heading south for the reasons we'll understand in just a moment. And unfortunately, the Third Fleet ends up in limbo. It doesn't get there in time. So the Third Fleet winds up doing very little in this whole battle, despite the fact that it's this gargantuan fleet. So, just to make this picture clear, going back, the landing force lands over here on this side of the Philippines. They've got the 7th Fleet with the battleships and so forth to protect them. Halsey's up here to the north, kind of steaming around, waiting to see if anything happens. Nishimura and Shima, in the meantime, have come up through Surigao Strait, and the 7th Fleet battleships are now focused down there. They're going after taking care of that problem. Meantime, Ozawa shows up to the north. Halsey sees Ozawa. Halsey's now dragged off to the north. Do you see a bad picture developing here? Because here comes Kurita, who, remember, has turned around in the meantime and come back through the Philippines. He comes out, and now he's got this landing force all to himself. Look at what he's got here, okay? Sizable force. This is not a good situation. Skip this. For some reason, I have the same thing in here twice. I apologize. Okay, here's the matchup. Kurita, this force you're looking at here, these are battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and a ton of destroyers. On the other side, we have escort aircraft carriers. Okay, these are little tiny aircraft carriers that were built for specific purposes, mostly to ferry things around, to launch ASW patrols. They weren't meant for heavy-duty battle against major fleets. In fact, the crew members of these say that CVE stands for combustible, volatile, and expendable, I think was the things at any rate. And they got a bunch of destroyers and destroyer escorts. These are not a match in anybody's calculus for these kinds of ships. They also have some aircraft on these little aircraft carriers, but they are armed up for anti-submarine warfare patrols and some anti-personnel stuff ashore to support the landing. So that's the setup. Battle of Samar takes place, and this is an amazing battle. These CVEs are arranged into 3 task groups, codenamed Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Here comes Kurita through the San Bernardino Strait, heading down early in the morning, and these guys look up and they see Japanese pagoda masts coming over the horizon, and they, what the hell? I mean, this is not an easy thing to contemplate. Powerful Japanese force descending upon them. Kurita comes unopposed. These task forces are the only thing that's left. The CVEs turn around and start heading away. Discretion is the better part of valor. Trouble is, top speed, 18 knots with a good tailwind, okay? These cruisers and battleships can go a lot faster than that. These aviators, though, despite the fact that they're not armed properly or whatever, in a great act of courage, attack these battleships and cruisers. They go after them big time. Some of them are dropping torpedoes, anti-submarine warfare depth charges and things. Some of them are using machine guns to strafe. Some of them don't even have any weapons, but they're just buzzing the Japanese to keep their heads down and so forth. Tremendous courage. On top of that, one of the great acts of courage in all of naval history, these destroyers and destroyer escorts, rather than run with the fleet, they turn and charge at the Japanese. Now, think about this for a minute. I mean, you can talk about John Paul Jones, and I revere John Paul Jones and what he did and so forth, but it doesn't get any better than this, folks. These destroyers go after these battleships. They come in so close that at some point the guns on the big ships can't even depress low enough because these ships are in so close, and they're launching whatever they have, torpedoes, gunfire, and so forth, attacking this superior Japanese force. As a result of this, I call it the Charge of the Light Brigade. Happened on the same anniversary, and it was in fact a very similar, it is a Light Brigade. Very quickly, one of the commanders is Ernest Evans. When he commissioned his ship, the USS Johnston, at the commissioning ceremony, he had been early in the war, he'd been driven off by the Japanese back in the Java Sea and so forth, had to retreat. He looked his crew in the eye and he said, "Gentlemen, make no mistake, I will never do that again." And he meant it. This guy was a class of 31 here at the Naval Academy, was part American Indian, and And interestingly enough, if you open up the cruise book or the yearbook for the class of 31, if you open up the inside leaf of that cruise book, beautiful rendition of John Paul Jones saying, "Give me a fast ship, for I, intend to go in harm's way." He gets a Medal of Honor for this. He also loses his life at this. His ship is sunk. The Johnston, USS Johnston, is sunk along with several others. Kurita attacks, as we said here. The ships run into a rain squall at first, the CVEs, and I've got too much detail. At any rate, we lose the Roberts, USS Roberts, the USS Johnston, the Gambier Bay, the Howell. These are all sunk in this act of courage. One might say it's a suicide mission. It was in many ways, but interestingly enough, suddenly Kurita turns tail and starts leaving. Never get a clear explanation as to why, but again, remember, this is the guy who'd taken a midnight swim, been through a lot. He actually turns, and Taffy 3 escapes, with the exception of the Gambier Bay, that one CVE. Please read this. Absolutely true. Only in America, right? They're getting away, God damn it. All right. So, final assessment. We've got 4 major engagements. It's basically the end of the Japanese fleet. They do come back in some small ways after that with what the remnants of what's left, but this is essentially the end. One thing that does happen, though, this is the beginning of the divine wind. This brings out this desperation of the kamikaze. Keep in mind, folks, that this is a brand new weapon. This is the forerunner of the guided missile, if you think about it. It's a different kind of guiding than what we would do today, or we Americans might do, but it is a guided missile. And it does great devastation at the ensuing battles. At Okinawa, a lot of people don't realize this, there was tremendous carnage on land at Okinawa, but there were more sailors killed at Okinawa by kamikazes than there were Marines ashore at Okinawa. So we've got, as I said earlier in the thing, the most multifaceted naval battle in history. All these other things I said before, lessons learned, all kinds of good stuff. So the big question is, why isn't Leyte Gulf a household word like Pearl Harbor? Almost everybody's heard of Pearl Harbor. Leyte Gulf, never heard of it. It's a matter of timing, I think, as much as anything else. It takes place late in the war. Battles have become commonplace. Victories become expected at this point in the war. We've been winning all of our major battles and so forth. And people don't realize at the time what a close call thing it might have been there off Samar. D-Day had just occurred a few months before this battle, big attention getter, and then of course it's eclipsed later by the atomic bomb. It kind of sandwiched in those events. So Leyte Gulf, despite all of this stuff that's there, is somewhat forgotten to a large extent. One might argue that because of these things, it's something worth writing about, which, as you probably know, I wrote about. And how are we doing on time? We got 2 more minutes?
We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Okay, let me, never mind, I'll skip that. Okay. I just wanted to make the point in my preface, if you do remember, but please read the preface in the last paragraph in there, because I talk about the awesome responsibility of writing about this stuff and the fact that I'm making all these criticisms and analysis and everything else, and I don't have a ship sinking under me. Very different kind of situation. So I want to make that point. Well, that's timely. That must be the hook. Questions, please.
Sir?
Yeah.
It appears that there's a good element of surprise here. Was it general knowledge that we were going to go to Leyte, or was there Japanese code breaking involved that they knew we were coming?
I don't think there was code breaking so much, but there was a lot of indication. They were keeping track of our movements and so forth, and they were not totally surprised, but there was some element of surprise. They knew we were coming somewhere, and they weren't quite sure. And in fact, they had several operational plans. I mentioned that one was called Show 1. They had Show 2, Show 3, Show 4. Show 2, I think, was for in case we had come to the Formosa like we were thinking about doing. I'm not sure which ones match up where. But this one was the one that dealt with Leyte Gulf. They were expecting us to come to the Philippines, and that was executed. Somebody else? Yes, sir.
Was the Marianas Turkey shoot part of this battle?
No, this is a separate thing. And in fact, I mentioned the Spruance factor. Spruance had been the commander in the Marianas Turkey shoot, and we had decimated. That's the reason why Ozawa's carriers don't have any pilots left, one of the reasons. We had decimated their flyers at the Marianas. Spruance had been in charge, and he did not pursue the Japanese fleet and was criticized for that by some people. They felt like he should have gone after the Japanese fleet. Spruance's feeling was, my job is to guard the landing area at the Marianas, and he carried out his mission that way, and I personally agree with that. But there was some criticism. And of course, Halsey did the exact opposite. He went aggressively in the opposite direction and probably should have stayed behind, or at least left part of the fleet behind, and did not do that and wound up. Spruance and Halsey both said later in their lives, if they had been able to switch places, they probably would have come out of that whole thing a whole lot better. Yes, sir.
How much communication was there between the Central and Southern striking forces? How much did Korea know about what was going on?
Very little, very little. Communications were terrible. The situation was, Japanese fleet was in a lot of disarray at this time. They didn't have good communications going on, and they frankly weren't making a great deal of effort for some reason. There was a lot of problems in the Japanese Navy at this time. So that's one of the factors in all this. You know, I criticize Kurita for, you want to criticize him for turning tail when he's winning the battle off Samar. But he doesn't know. One of the things that I think enters into this, he doesn't even know who he's fighting. Keep in mind, these fleets have never seen each other. Very rarely have Japanese or Americans seen each other. They're all fighting by air in these big air battles and so forth. So these surface ships are now looking at each other, right within range, can see each other. And his people are reporting there's a battleship, because they're expecting to see big carriers, battleships. They're expecting Halsey's force there. And they see these little carriers and these little destroyers, and they're reporting them as fleet carriers and battleships, because they don't realize what they're seeing, I think. And there's that expectation that that's what they were going to encounter. So he's not even sure who he's fighting. And then that's one of the elements. And he also figures the way these American destroyers, this great act of courage I talk about, they're charging in the face of certain death. He figures, what do they know that I don't? I mean, I think it has a psychological effect. These guys are coming at me. They must know something I don't, right? And that's part of the reason, I think. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so Korea's been criticized ever since for turning around, but I wonder if there's any clear understanding of what would have happened if he made it to the beaches. Would it have really impacted the story of the battle in the end, do you think?
It's hard to say. I mean, worst case scenario, he sinks a lot of transports that are there, anchored, very vulnerable and so forth, delays the landing operations, maybe gives the Japanese forces ashore a chance to do something. There's a lot of things that could have happened. Would they have happened is questionable. But keep in mind, if we had suffered a major defeat, they had sunk a lot of American ships, no matter what kind there, this would have a big effect. We got a presidential election coming up around this time. This is October. Got a presidential election coming up, and we could wind up with a different president with the wrong kind of outcome here. So there could have been some major effects on this. It's all speculation, of course, but good possibility. Some possibility. Yes, sir?
How far was Halsey from Korea when Korea turned around? Had Halsey already turned around to come back, or was he too far north?
He's too far north. No way they could reach it. If you ever read Winds of War and War and Remembrance by Herman Wouk, wonderful novels about World War II. In War and Remembrance, there's a wonderful passage there where Pug Henry, the protagonist in all this, is on one of these battleships in Halsey's task group, and he's caught in this limbo, and he describes what it's like to be there in the midst of the greatest naval battle in history and can't do anything about it because we're just too far away and so forth. It's heartrending, it really is. Yes, sir?
Were the troops ashore hurrying because all our attention was focused, on ships rather than supporting troops?
No, I don't think so. I think they were, to some degree, not even aware of what was going on to a large degree. This stuff is taking parts out of sea. Yes, sir?
Weren't they deprived of air support from Taffy's 1, 2, and 3?
Yes, for a while, that's true. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. You're absolutely right. And I don't know of any major impact as a result of that, but there may have been. Of course, if I'm a troop on the shore and my air cover suddenly goes away, it's not a good thing. So it's a good point.
Did Kincaid have any reserve forces, or did he commit all of his support force to the Battle of Surigao Strait?
As far as I know, it was the vast majority. There's no question about that. He may have, I think he left a few elements. No, I don't think there were any. I think all of his major warships went down to Surigao Strait and concentrated on there.
In essence, he made the supposition that Halsey was going
Absolutely.
to be supporting and taking everything else.
Yes.
But that was never made explicit between the two commanders.
Exactly. That's precisely what's wrong. They did not coordinate among themselves. We talk about Nishimura and Shima not talking to each other. Well, Halsey and Kincaid aren't talking a whole lot either, and that's a lot of the problem. You're absolutely correct on that. Big source of yes, sir.
Did the Kurita survive the war and get interviewed about his viewpoint on this battle?
Yes. He survived the war, and he was interviewed several times. He didn't give very many interviews. He was very reclusive. But there was one in particular when I was researching the book that I paid a lot of attention to, and he did answer the question, why did you turn? And I read the answer 42 times, and I still don't know what he said. It's not clear. He just does not make it very clear. It's a lot of kind of double talk. Sounds a lot like a politician, but at any rate, unfortunately, never makes it clear why he did what he did.
You know, you pretty much laid out the case. A, they're shooting and dropping bombs. The enemy, just a 2, recognition was terrible, particularly in the Pacific Fleet.
Sure.
Because they didn't get into contact with each other,
That's
and
right.
the pilots were not very good at recognizing the enemy ships anyhow, our pilots.
Oh, yeah.
And certainly, he didn't have any air, so it was just surface recognition. And third, he didn't know where the Third Fleet was, and you know, I'm a tactical commander. I'm going to assume it's there.
Sure.
Just because that's the if you don't assume that, you're going to get yourself killed for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So those 3 things, I believe, are the contributing factors, and Kurita had, you know, continue or turn around. Those
Yeah.
were his decisions.
Yeah, no, I
And
agree
his
with you. I agree with you.
future lead.
I do think, you know, it's a reasonable expectation that Halsey would be in the vicinity or would at least leave part of his force there. That's the thing that's amazing, is that he took this entire gigantic fleet with him. I've tried to figure that one out. And one of the things I did, I went up to the War College and I read Halsey's, looked at his student transcript when he was a student at the War College and read a paper that he wrote, which was not a whole lot better than Kurita's interview, but at any rate, and tried to figure out what Halsey was all about. And he was kind of a black and white kind of guy. Things are either or, you know, that comes through kind of clearly. And if you read Mahan, Alfred Thayer Mahan, one of the things that comes across is never divide your fleet. You know, this is there, and that was being taught at the War College. And I think Halsey took that in big time, so he didn't divide his fleet. Never mind, he could have divided it 4 times and still won the war, but he didn't divide his fleet. He took the whole thing with him.
Looking for the decisive battle.
Decisive battle, exactly. Done?
Well, there's one quick question. Anybody else?
Okay.
Just a few quick items. Thank you, sir. Really
Yeah, sure.
appreciate it. If you'd like Commander Cutler's book, we've got several copies downstairs in the museum bookstore. We also would invite you to come back next week. We have Lincoln Payne speaking about his book, The Sea and Civilization. I just finished it. Fantastic book. Spans across history. And I also would invite you, after we're done here, if you'd like to come up, see the models, and our ship model curator, Don Kroll, would be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much. Please spread the word about the lecture series.